Hey everybody, back like we never left. So today I thought that I would follow up on the reading of Heraclitus' fragments with a discussion about Heraclitus' metaphysics. Metaphysics are the study of philosophical first principles or propositions that we would like to be true and that are supposed to undergird a philosophy, things that generally frame the way that we're going to look about particular points that a philosopher would make and their widest scoping most fundamental claims. So I think that a good way to start this is I'm going to lay out a general map of what Heraclitus' metaphysical basis is, and there's a few points, and after I lay them out in broad stroke, we'll go into each of them, give fragments to support them, and talk a little more deeply about where he's coming from in general, which would be really helpful to better understand his wider view and to be able to explore a lot of the more fun Heraclitus fragments that people talk a lot about and that really pique people's interest. But without properly understanding where he's coming from in a wider sense, all these points are going to be a bit moot. So, there are 6 principles that we're going to talk about today. I thought I would frame them in fragment style form before we get into them. It'll be fun. So the first one is that change is constant. The second one is that the world is one thing, or process, depending on how you look at it. The third is that it's all about perspective. Fourth is that the world has a way of its own. Fifth, wisdom is one thing. And sixth, most people are ignorant. Let's hop right into the first principle, which was that change is constant. Now, what does Heraclitus mean by this? So I think that the 12th fragment will help us illuminate this point a little better. On those who enter the same rivers, ever different waters flow. And there's another formulation of this, which is that you cannot step in the same river twice. The second one is probably the one that you've heard if you're a fan of Heraclitus. It's quite common and popular. So I think that the easiest way to understand this is if you really think about the contents of the river and the formulation of the river in a very minute, down to like the particulate level, you're going to realize that even if you walked into the same river 30 seconds after you just left it, there's something fundamentally different about the river. Things aren't exactly as they were before. The particular water molecules are 10 meters downstream. The dust has been kicked up. There's more particulate in the water because you walked in it. The river is just different. Erosion's been happening at a really slow rate for a very long time, but just because you can't notice it with a bare eye doesn't mean that it hasn't happened. There's something fundamentally different about this river, and that happens at every moment. The world re-updates itself, and things just aren't the same. So that's fundamentally what Heraclitus is getting at here, that if we really look down at the microscopic level, whether that be literally at the microscopic level or more figuratively, we will notice that things change. Time has an effect on things that cause them to not be exactly the same as they were before. And when you move within this continuum of time, you're not going to be able to experience the same thing twice. Things will always change. Heraclitus makes it pretty easy for us to understand how this would work from our perspective. We can all imagine ourselves standing at the bank of some river and walking through it and walking back into it again and conceptualize that something has changed. But another way that he brings this home is by talking about the world in the terms that the Greeks understood it, with the 4 fundamental elements, fire, water, earth, and air, and they're intermixing. So there's been a discussion within their framework about if there was a fundamental element out of which all things came, or if there were equal mixings of these elements, or if there was maybe a little bit of water and a lot of air, or any such combination of these things. People had thought about it. And Heraclitus came to the conclusion that fire is really the fundamental element, and that it transforms into everything else. So fragment 30 will talk about this. It says, first, sea. And of sea, half is earth, half whirlwind. Sea pours out and is measured by the same amount as before it became earth. And I forgot to mention that is titled The Transformation of Fire. So fire first transforms into sea, and then half of the sea is earth, half of it is whirlwind, which is air. And the sea's poured out, and it can be measured by the same amount as before it became earth. So the idea there is that while this fire is transforming, there's the particular mix-up of these things might be different, but at the same time, we can maintain the sort of constancy of the mix. So there could still be at any point 1/4 each of these things, but the constitutive elements won't be exactly the same. It was fire that became water, and that water will become something else. And so there might be the same amount, but these things are changing and mixing. It's like stirring a pot, maybe, where when you stir things, they change into something else, and it's a cyclical cycle. What else would it be? Fragment 30 also kind of explicates this a bit. It says, "This world, which is the same for all, no one, gods or man, have made, but it always was, is and never will be, an ever-living fire, with measures of it kindling and measures going out." So here's Heraclitus says that the fundamental element is always raging, and that's really what his metaphor for the world and its continued existence is. And when I say world, I mean in the largest sense we can imagine, something like a universe. But he doesn't dispute that the fire can look different. It's, if we've all sat at a campfire, there's never been two moments where the fire looks exactly the same, but we could still say that this is a fire that's been going on for some period of time. And that's sort of how Heraclitus views the world, where we might add a little bit of wood on the south side of the fire, and there'll be more fire there, and the north side of the fire might go out, but there's still fire. It'll light up somewhere else, it'll go out somewhere else, and that's just how things are, always changing. So having elucidated these things, I think it's also important to mention that Heraclitus has a view, in a sense, of how fire consistently pushes the world forward as its catalyst to change, more or less. In Fragment 66, it says, "Fire in its advance will judge and convict all things." So, in a sense, fire is an interesting first element because it gives this image of something that's burning. It has life in it, baked into its core. It's consuming things. It's exhausting them and being let out. And so this fire of the world is really something where there's fuel all around it, and there's this inferno. And as it tears through things turn to dust, and other things are set alight. And this process doesn't really stop. It keeps going. And that's how the world works. But if we were to stop frame at any moment, we'd be seeing a different fire. It would look different. It would be burning different things. And there's nothing wrong with that or anything. Heraclitus isn't making value judgments here. He's just saying that this is the fundamental way of the world. Nothing is really held in place for very long. So understanding that is pretty important to understanding how he's going to be talking about anything else, because that view is actually a bit radical if you think about it. There really isn't a way to pin down what anything is at one moment. It's constructed of constitutive elements which are always in flux. And nothing repeats itself. There's, in a sense, a big issue with the identity of things. There's the reductio, in his view, ends up coming back to there's just one thing, which is what we're going to get to next. So, the second principle that we're going to talk about here is that the world is one thing or process. So I think Fragment 10 most clearly explicates what Heraclitus is trying to say here. So he says, "Graspings, things whole and not whole, what is torn asunder and drawn together, the harmonious and the discordant. The one is made up of all things, and all things issue from the one." So really what we can see here is a way of viewing the world as not... There's really two fundamental ways that I think that you can construct a world made up of parts that seem really different. We could say that all of the parts put together are one thing. Or we can say something that's really just a little bit different, which is that there's one thing and we can view each of its individual constitutive elements as parts. And I think that's really what Heraclitus is trying to say here. The difference is a little minute. Sometimes I like to think about drawing a big circle and then drawing lines within it so that you never go outside of the circle. You can really construct an infinite number of things inside of that, depending on how you draw these lines. And that's Heraclitus' view. And then a more traditional view, I think a lot of the time with other philosophers and just in general, is that there's a lot of little things, a lot of little circles, and we can sort of, as a thought exercise in a sense, draw one big circle around it, and that would be everything. But Heraclitus is saying that no, that's missing the point. There's one thing, and it has constitutive elements, and in a sense, we're the ones who bring them into existence by calling them that. Because if we really look at it, there's really nothing so harmonious about any particular thing. I think that one way that he kind of also illuminates this idea that it's kind of silly to talk about things as individual things and not as parts of a big one is the way that he talks about how opposites are really the thing that construct what we view as a particular thing. So if we were to talk about a mountain slope, perhaps, we can understand that there's a top and a bottom, there's an up and a down, but really the slope is the whole thing. So it's kind of confusing when you think about it. Like the way that this mountain exists is such that in order for us to talk about this slope, we're really not going to be able to talk about it without including this tension of opposites, this peak in the bottom of this mountain and this slope that runs up it. And that whole tension between the top and the bottom that allows us to view this slope, as something in between it, is the thing that gives rise to the slope. But in a sense, none of these things really can exist without each other, and they only exist because we're looking at it and calling it a slope. So it's an interesting view. It's kind of a compound view in a sense, where maybe it doesn't make sense to talk about the existence of individual substances as harmonies between opposite things, and as substances as sort of illusions and parts of one at the same time. But I think that sometimes this is kind of an interesting way to illustrate it, because if you really keep zooming back, I think that's Heraclitus' point in a sense. It's very difficult to pin out individual things, and even the individual things that we pin out aren't really one thing. They're two very different things that we draw a circle around. And that's more or less the way he views his world, where you can draw the slope or you can circle the slope, but if you really were to just expand that, the slope doesn't really stop with the very bottom of the mountain. It can be extended down to the sea level and then down to the ocean bed. These things are not really so simple, so cut and dry, so existent as things in themselves. So this kind of also really undergirds his philosophy, where you can always draw a larger network of association to something. Things are always more complicated than they seem. They're bigger. They're, constructed in such a way that they don't make as much sense as we'd like them to. And if we really look at things long and hard, we'll kind of recognize that a lot of the time, the things that we take for granted as simple things are actually really not so simple, so cut and dry, so obviously existent as things in themselves. They're really part of a much larger picture. Personally, I think that this third principle is one of Heraclitus' more insightful principles, because people aren't talking very much about psychology in this period, and I think that Heraclitus is really one of the fundamental psychologists of the Western tradition of thought. And I think that one way we can see this is that baked into his metaphysics is an understanding that perspective is really fundamental to how we understand the world. So there's, I think, a few interesting ways that we can look at this. There's one which is interspecies, and there's one which is really about perception. So we'll start with the perception one with fragment 3, where Heraclitus says that the sun is the width of a human foot. And obviously this sounds preposterous on its face, but if you really think about it, if you were to sit down at a park somewhere and kick your feet up, take off your shoes, place them right in front of the sun, it would be potentially the same width. You could certainly frame it to be such. And that's a true statement. Like the truth conditions for the statement that the sun is the width of the human foot can easily be satisfied by a person, even if the sun is actually 1,000,000 times the size of the earth, in some scientific worldview. Both of these things are true in Heraclitus' view, which I think is interesting, where he doesn't discount that your lived experience, sort of your phenomenal experience, if we're going to update the terms, is fundamental. It has primacy. And then another one, which I think is interesting, that kind of ties into another larger Greek discussion about happiness, is fragment 4, where he says, "If happiness consisted in the pleasures of the body, we should call oxen happy whenever they come across bitter vetch to eat." And so I think that what he's talking about, he is obviously dissing the idea that happiness consists in the pleasures of the body. But I think another thing that he's driving in is that pleasures of the body are not universal things. So the perspective of your species existence is going to be the thing that will, bring rise to what's important to you, how the world makes sense. And obviously this is something I think we take for granted. We understand that our dogs and cats have very different priorities than we do. But it is interesting to see somebody from this period not making big exceptions for humans and considering them very special, because he would say the same thing about eating chocolate for humans, that it might not be what happiness is, but this is this is what the pleasures of the body look like for us. And so that's how it is. And in a similar sense, if you change between people, between species, what's going to be important will look very different. And there's a number of other points that can illustrate this. I think that the one that does it the best is Fragment 9. For a horse, a dog, and a human have different pleasures. Asses prefer straw to gold, since asses find food sweeter than gold. So this is sort of his point, where it's made very obvious between species, and I think that isn't the most profound point of all time. I think we all can, in a sense, understand this, but it is an interesting thing to bake into your philosophy, and I think it's something that's of primitive importance to him, especially when we consider the differences between people. I don't think that this is meant to be exclusively between people, or between species, I'm sorry. It's important to realize that Heraclitus is talking about just in general, the way that you see the world from where you're standing is going to construct meaning for you. That's what's going to create what you see, and the sort of objective reality, if you want to use air quotes, and he probably would, isn't so cut and dry, and is at least competing for primacy about the truth, with just how you see the world and what makes sense to you, what seems pleasurable. These things are all not really contestable. It's if your foot is up in front of the sun and it blocks the sun widthwise, it's the width of the sun. This is just as true as saying that the sun is very, very large. So Heraclitus bakes in at a pretty fundamental level that the way that we look at the world can't really be constructed so cut and dry without considering how people interact with it, or animals in general. Just where you're standing is very, very important. Alrighty, so the fourth principle has a little bit less content to it, I think, than the other ones, and it's kind of a basic claim, but I think it's important to mention that Heraclitus is not the type of person who thinks that the world is operating in some sort of way that is very considerate to people. So the principle is that the world has a way of its own, and I think the fragment that would explicate this the best is that fire in its advance will judge and convict all things. So fire is the fundamental element, and everything gets run over by it. Like the process of life and existence, in a sense, is that there is this ever-kindling fire, and you are the tinder, and occasionally it's your turn to be lit up, and you light up and burn, and then you're ash, and that's that. So it's not a very happy picture in a sense, but it does kind of capture the point that this larger process is something that is not subject to your whims or desires. So I think that it would actually be smart to do the fifth and sixth principle together, because I think they work in concert. So the fifth principle is that wisdom is one thing, and the sixth principle is that most people are ignorant. So obviously it seems like this is not a very inclusive philosophy. I think that Heraclitus does privilege people who have a lot of time to think about these sorts of things and who share his views. So that's something to be taken with a grain of salt. A lot of people are uncomfortable with views that exclude the many, and I think this view is one of them. But sometimes they have their perks. So fragment 2, I think, is something that will really hammer home how this is both this is not an exclusive view, and that the wisdom is just one thing. So fragment 2 says, though the logos is common, the many live as if they had a wisdom of their own. And logos is Greek. It stands in for logic. So the logic of the world, the thought that guides all these things, it's just one thing. You either know it or you don't. And there's plenty of people, according to Heraclitus, who are running around acting as if they have their corner on their truth. And he says there is no your truth. There is a truth. There's one truth. There's one thought that guides everything. And if you don't know it, you don't know. I think that fragment 34 really ties in this dual point again. He says, hearing they do not understand, like the deaf. Of them does the saying bear witness. Present, they are absent. So Heraclitus has this frustration that it seems like no matter how much he espouses his truth, sometimes people just cannot accept it, will not accept it. There is some sort of discordance. And I think that he thinks that just like a sound is impossible to deny, we hear something and it's heard. It's a simple thing like that. You either hear it or you don't. But here he thinks that there's this level of processing, which is really the issue, where people hear the truth that he espouses, but they don't tend to understand it. He brings this home in another way too, where he says that learned people also sometimes don't know the truth. They're not wise. They don't know what's important. He says in Fragment 40, the learning of many things does not teach understanding. Otherwise, it would have been Hesiod and Pythagoras, and again, Xenophon and Hecataeus. And so these are learned people from the period of time. Obviously, we see some mathematicians that we all recognize, Pythagoras. And he is a person that was well known to know lots of things. He was very well educated, obviously very smart. And yet he is not the person who is pushing this message of understanding the way of the world. He knows kind of ontic truths, little particular things about the world, some natural laws that make it work, but not the thought that steers all these things, which is what wisdom is according to Heraclitus. In Fragment 41, following right up, Heraclitus will explain what he means by wisdom, which I think is something that we have been lacking for a moment, which is that wisdom is one thing. It is to know the thought by which all things are steered through all things. So I think that we've nailed down here, generally speaking, a bunch of Heraclitus's fundamental principles. It's that change is constant. We can't avoid it. It's happening all the time. Things are changing in big ways and little ways, and we're changing. So there's really no constancy for us to hold on to in this world. The second is that the world is one thing. It's not a collection of particulars that make up a whole. It's one whole that can be subjectively seen as particular things that really don't have as much substantial reality to them as we would like to grant them from our perspective. It's just the way that we project our views onto the world that allows us to think of things as things in themselves. Third, it's that the world has a way of its own. This fire is kindling and advancing, and it's not asking us for permission or anything like this. The gods and the way of the world are operating outside of our influence, and we are influenced by them, in fact. So this is sort of a Stoic point where the world is larger than you, and he makes that abundantly clear. Fifth, it's that wisdom is one thing. We just saw that. There's a thought that steers all things, the logos that's common to all things, and if you know that, you know what's important, you are wise, you know the truth, and otherwise you don't. And that is an issue to Heraclitus, and that's why he thinks that a lot of people are ignorant, because they might know lots of particular things, but a lot of people miss his point that if you don't understand the thing that ties all these things together, that tension of opposites, that principle that change is constant. The world is operating in this way. It's one thing. It's not what you think it is. It depends on how you look at it. The true statements of things are really subjective to whether or not to perspective and things like that. This world is something different than what we think it is, and in general, that there is a logical, coherent structure that guides all these things. And if you don't understand this structure, you don't get it. It's like they say, if you don't get it, you don't get it. I think on that note, I'll wrap up this episode. Next time, I want to talk about the psychology of Heraclitus, the way he thinks about people. There's a lot of really interesting claims he makes really early in the tradition of thinking about how people think, what motivates them, how they operate. So I think that this will be really interesting. There's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot of fun quotes that I think that people can take with them and will remember and can help them provide a little bit of basic understanding about people from a long time ago, which I think is something that's kind of special.